You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Katie Putz, the Diplomats managing editor and resident Central Asia expert. Katie, how's it going today?
Going all right, I guess.
Well, welcome to 2021. That's both for you, Katie, and for our listeners. It's a brand new year, and we'll certainly have a lot to talk about on the Asia Geopolitics podcast this year, especially with a presidential transition just around the corner in the United States, a continuing pandemic that continues to weigh on geopolitics around the world. But today, Katie, what I'm hoping to talk about is really what we just saw in Central Asia. I can't recall ever beginning a year with a podcast on Central Asia, but I think Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, both with their various elections this past week, have given us a good reason to zero in. So let's start by talking, of course, about the background here. So Kyrgyzstan just had a snap presidential election, and Kazakhstan had a parliamentary election, and we'll talk a little bit about the outcomes in both. Kyrgyzstan, I think, being the slightly more interesting one to begin with. So why don't we start there, Katie? Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the background leading up to this snap election? Why did this election take place when it did?
So the immediate cause for this presidential election, which took place on January 10th, was the resignation of Soronbay Jeenbekov, the previous president of Kyrgyzstan, on October 15th. Yes, October 15th. And his resignation was prompted by sort of this political collapse after the October 4th parliamentary elections, which were very swiftly annulled, and a whole bunch of government resignations of the prime minister, speakers, just all across the board, political chaos. And amid that chaos rose a figure named Sadar Japarov, who had been in jail until the protests after the sort of botched parliamentary election, and very quickly and almost bizarrely was swept into power as prime minister, and then with his supporters in the streets, pressured Jeenbekov into resigning and took on the mantle of acting president
Mm-hmm.
for about a month. In Kyrgyzstan, it's illegal for an acting president to run for president. So Japarov resigned in mid-November so that he could run for president. And on election day, the results came in and didn't necessarily surprise anyone. He came out with close to 80% of the vote, and will be the next Kyrgyz president. And that has a lot of serious implications, I'm sure we'll talk about. But the other election that Kyrgyzstan had on the 10th was a referendum. It was initially proposed as it was supposed to be a constitutional referendum on amendments to the Constitution. It got boiled down to really just the basic question of what government system do the Kyrgyz want? Do they want a presidential system or a parliamentary system? Almost 81% of those who voted for the presidential system. So there will be a follow-on referendum tentatively scheduled for March, which presumably would be on a new draft constitution that reflects that choice of presidential system. The last thing I want to say in this sort of opening bit is that turnout was really low. It was under 40%, but above 30%. 30% is the threshold for a referendum to be legitimate. There is no legal threshold for the legitimacy of the presidential or parliamentary elections, but there is a threshold for referendums. For sort of for a comparative sense, this election was just under 40%. The previous presidential election in 2017 that brought Jeenbekov to power was in the mid 50s. I think it was 56%.
Mm-hmm.
So this was definitely lower turnout than previous elections, and that I think at least does have implications for what kind of support we draw from that nearly 80% win. It's 80% of only 40% of the population who could vote.
Right. Well, so Japarov is president. We have a constitutional referendum around the corner opting for a presidential system in Kyrgyzstan, and turnout was low. So
Yes.
taking all of this together and sort of looking forward, Katie, I mean, what does this say to you about Kyrgyzstan's polity? Because traditionally, Kyrgyzstan has been the one sort of bright spot in Central Asia in terms of the way in which democracy functions and just in terms of its polity overall. Do you have a more pessimistic sense now going forward with these new developments?
Definitely. I mean, and this is maybe a reflection of the hype about Kyrgyzstan being this sort of shining democracy on a hill, to completely butcher the phrase, was maybe too optimistic in the past, and this sort of reflects conditions as they actually are, which is a deeply corrupted political system. Japarov was in prison until like a week before he became prime minister. His rise was most certainly backed by somebody, and the fact that it's very unclear who, should sort of worry us all, who are sort of who care about Kyrgyzstan's future. I think the other sort of the other answer to that question is that, you know, the democratic outlook for Kyrgyzstan is really troubling. But the interesting thing about returning to a presidential system is it hyper focuses all attention on one figure. Of the five elected, or the, well, four were elected, but of Kyrgyzstan's five full presidents, not counting interim presidents, three have been forced out of power, two through revolutions in 2005 and 2010, Zhinbekov in 2017. The other the other president is Almazbek Atambayev, who is still in jail awaiting retrial of his first trial, which had convicted him and then got overturned, and they're doing it again, and another trial, and then you have Japarov. So the outlook for Kyrgyz presidents is never really good, and so I think, um, given the monumental challenges that remain that have nothing to do with Kyrgyzstan's politics. Well, they do have to do with its politics, but the economy is probably the biggest challenge. If the president can't address that problem, and they switch to a system in which he becomes the center of that system, then all responsibility is going to rest for him. And there's no reason the Kyrgyz won't toss him out also. Now, all of this tumult is why Kyrgyzstan continues to have sort of these endemic problems that sort of keep its economy at a pretty much broken state. But the polity is just very broken, and I think a lot of sort of the earnest Democrats in Kyrgyzstan who really believe in sort of the power of a democracy are just really depressed, because they haven't been able to make good on that the promise that was Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah, I mean, so also in the short term, I mean, are we, should we be expecting sustained popular discontent, protests? I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, the turnout was low and this was a small percentage, but, the government is going to present the referendum in particular as, I think, being, widely supported, just given the percentage of folks that actually voted for it, even if turnout was low. So how do you think that's going to play out?
I mean, yeah, the second sort of referendum, which is going to be on a draft constitution, a new constitution, I think is going to draw a lot of attention, and there remains the potential of more civil unrest, of Shaparov getting thrown out of power, of lots of things happening. I think all of those cards remain on the table. It's perhaps worthy of noting that it is winter in Kyrgyzstan now, and which, if you look at the timing of the previous revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, they all happened in the spring and summer. So I think there is definitely, I think Japarov has a short window of time to sort of make good on the promise of I can do this job, before both the referendum happens, probably in March, and then the people are going to want him to do that job. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned is the parliamentary election that happened in October was annulled. So Kyrgyzstan is still sort of riding on the old parliament. New parliamentary elections are promised for some time before the middle of 2021. We don't have a date for those yet. And depending on what the new constitution says about the sort of architecture of the government, we just don't know what the legislative part of the Kyrgyz government looks like or is, but that's something to watch and could be potentially another sort of flashpoint. I certainly am expecting more protests in Kyrgyzstan, and and there have always been a lot of protests in Kyrgyzstan in some ways, and then some of them sort of turn into these revolutions, and then some don't. So I wouldn't go so far as saying that Japarov will be thrown out of power, but statistically speaking, he probably won't serve a full term.
Right. So we'll come back in a moment to talk about the regional implications, if there are any. But first, I wanted to just switch bases and talk a little bit about Kazakhstan. And this one, I think, was the more, let's say, predictable of the two scenarios. So, Katie, do you want to just give us a little bit of background for the parliamentary elections and the outcome in Kazakhstan? What exactly happened?
Yeah, so Kazakhstan had parliamentary elections. They were held slightly early by like a couple of weeks, but they were notable because they were the first parliamentary elections since the resignation of Nursultan Nazarbayev that happened in March 2019. And sort of the transition of the presidency to a new individual, to Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who was then elected in June 2019 to a full presidential term of his own. Nazarbayev remains an incredibly powerful figure in Kazakhstan in a number of official and unofficial roles. One of his official roles is head of the ruling party, which is called Nur Otan, and Nur Otan came out on top in the election. Like you said, it's not a surprise. They secured 71% of the vote, which is going to translate to 76 seats out of 107 in the lower house of the parliament. In the previous parliament, Nur Otan had They had 84 seats. So it's technically they lost a few seats, but overall, Nur Otan continues to run the show. There are two other parties that cleared the threshold to make it into the parliament, a party called Akjol, and then the People's Party, which until November 2020 was the Communist People's Party, and they are going to have 12 and 10 seats respectively. They each had 7 in the previous parliament. I don't think that these sort of small number changes really reflect all that much about the popular will. All of these parties are pro-government parties. And for those who are doing numbers, there are 9 more seats in the parliament, but those are all appointed by this sort of representative body called the Assembly of the People, which is intended to make sure that the many ethnic groups in Kazakhstan are also represented in the parliament. Its members are appointed by the president, so these are essentially 9 more Nur Otan seats. And so the election itself, whereas in Kyrgyzstan had very low turnout, the Kazakh authorities claim turnout was in the 60s, and there were a number of small demonstrations and protests in various cities in Kazakhstan. Some of the most dramatic scenes were in Almaty, which is the largest city in Kazakhstan, in the former capital, and these were not dramatic in sort of the loud sense, but in the sense that there were these videos of groups of maybe 12 protesters being completely surrounded by police who just stood in like a wall around them for hours. They weren't allowed to move from the spot. The temperatures were freezing. They couldn't leave to go to the bathroom. They couldn't leave to get food. They were literally just kettled in the middle of a street. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple of instances of observers and journalists being denied entry into polling locations. But by and large, it was as the OSCE says, a very well-run election with no competition.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's I think what we'd come to expect. So, but overall, I mean, here, I guess looking forward, there's more continuity to be expected in Kazakhstan. I mean, is that generally right?
Yeah, I mean, and there was never going to be an upset. There were no new opposition parties allowed to register, even though last year the state went through some political reforms, for example, lowering the threshold for registering a new party from 40,000 to 20,000 members. Still, nobody was really able to clear that threshold. There were no new parties. There were no new sort of voices. All of the 5 parties that did run were pro-government. The one legally registered sort of nominally opposition party boycotted the election. Going forward, the most interesting thing will be to watch who is appointed to where, because these sort of really like chess moves in terms of appointments and positions, that's where the real politics occur in Kazakhstan, sort of at that elite level. And we don't know quite how all of that's going to roll out yet. Narotan released its list of the 76 deputies it's going to send to parliament, and on that list is Dariga Nazarbayeva, who's the daughter of Nursultan Nazarbayev. So that's again not surprising, but is sort of a person to watch for a number of reasons. And so we're kind of, those of us watching this unfold are waiting to see what those appointments are, and then kind of trying to read the tea leaves of what they mean.
Mm-hmm. So, Katie, as we come to the end of our discussion today, I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little on, I guess, the outcome of both these recent elections in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and their possible effect on regional stability in Central Asia, if at all, if there are any consequences. I think that's a little clearer in the case of Kazakhstan, where, as you said, we are expecting more continuity, but also on how states like Russia and China, especially, who do have strong interests in this region, view these outcomes. What's your take?
So I think it's not really worth talking about Kazakhstan in this respect. Really, like you've said, it's continuity. So all of Kazakhstan's partners are getting out of this process exactly what they previously had. There's no upsets there. Kyrgyzstan is more interesting, and I think has always concerned its neighbors for sort of this political volatility that it has, and really and so countries like Russia have been watching very carefully the process in Kyrgyzstan. Vladimir Putin congratulated Zhaparov on his victory. Zhaparov, in his first speech after winning the election, sort of talked down the rumors that he's just going to become a dictator, but he used the line, we're going to have a dictatorship of law and justice, which is borrowing directly a phrase from President Putin. So I think there's going to be more synergy in that Kyrgyzstan-Russia relationship, and the Russians are pretty happy with the outcome. When it comes to China, I haven't actually looked at what the Chinese government has said about this process, but I can assume they congratulated Zhaparov on the election, just sort of the normal tone of relations there. They're going to be watching and concerned on Kyrgyzstan's economic sort of state. Kyrgyzstan has 1.8 billion in loans to the Exim Bank of China that are going to be coming due, and has been asking China for more time. So there's going to be some tough negotiations there in terms of loan repayment and deferrals, which I think is going to make Zhaparov's nationalist rhetoric kind of difficult to maintain, while also possibly having to sell off some assets to the Chinese in terms of sort of mining rights or things like that. One interesting facet that we're going to need to watch, both because there will be a new administration in Washington next week, and this sort of turn of events in Kyrgyzstan, is the U.S.-Kyrgyzstan relationship is, I think, going to be headed for some more friction. And you could see this almost immediately. The embassy in Bishkek congratulated the Kyrgyz people on engaging in the election and recognized Sadyr Japarov on his election, but did not congratulate Sadyr Japarov. And I went back and looked at the statement that was issued after the 2017 election, in which Zhinbekov won, and that statement directly congratulated Zhinbekov. So there is a change in sort of tone there, and I think there is potential for friction. The embassy in Bishkek, the U.S. embassy in Bishkek, had during the October political unrest, had pointed out that there were criminal elements sort of involved in all of this political machinations, and that was definitely a veiled reference to Zhaparov and sort of his backers. So I think that relationship could be a little bit awkward, especially if the Biden administration comes in with, as it I think many people expect it to, with a greater focus on democracy and human rights, and sort of the more traditional sort of handbag that the United States used to carry around in Central Asia, that under the Trump administration was definitely not a priority. So I think there's Kyrgyzstan, while I don't think its regional relationships are going to change necessarily, I think as the affairs stand now, the United States is probably not super happy about the turn of events, and Russia is definitely happy about the turn of events.
Got it. Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining me on this first podcast in 2021 and sharing your insights on Central Asia. Thanks a lot.
As always, it's a pleasure.
Great. And for listeners, please, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you leave us a review on any of your preferred podcast outlets. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so so you can keep up with future episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.